On the night of the 18th of March, 1982, the world's most dangerous man was not a soldier or a king, but a singer in a silver Rolls-Royce. At 31 years old, Teddy Pendergrass was the physical definition of alpha masculinity, a velvet storm who didn't just sing about desire, he dictated it. His voice was a primal force that could turn a room of 10,000 strangers into a private confession. But in a split second on a dark road in Philadelphia, that king was dethroned by a guardrail. The forensics of that moment are chilling. The sound of twisting metal, the sudden lack of oxygen, and the snap of a spinal cord that turned the world's greatest lover into a statue of flesh. Before the crash, his sound was a baptism. It was a slow burn, a deep baritone ache that felt like a secret whispered directly into the marrow of your bones. When Teddy Pendergrass walked onto a stage, the air itself seemed to grow heavy. He didn't just perform, he conducted a ritual of intimacy. Women whispered his name like a forbidden prayer, and men studied his calm, trying to find the source of that quiet, terrifying authority. But every legend has a shadow, and Teddy's shadow was born long before he ever touched a microphone. To understand the man who would eventually have to find his soul in total stillness, we have to look at the miracle that emerged from a house of ghosts. Philadelphia, 1950. Teddy Pendergrass entered the world carrying a weight no child should bear. His mother, Etta, was a woman who had been hollowed out by grief, having lost 6 children before him. 6 times she had prepared a nursery, and 6 times she had walked to a graveyard. When Teddy finally survived, he wasn't just a son, he was a biological resurrection. He was her 7th child, and her only answer to a silent God. But the miracle was incomplete. His father, Jesse, vanished before Teddy's first breath. Teddy would only see his father twice in his life, once to witness his existence, and once to identify his body after Jesse was stabbed to death when Teddy was 12. This void, the absence of a father, and the heavy expectation of a grieving mother, pushed Teddy toward the only sanctuary Harlem and Philly could offer, the church. By age 2, he was standing on wooden chairs, his tiny voice vibrating with a frequency that made the elders weep. By 10, he was an ordained minister, preaching with a baritone that sounded like it had been aged in oak and smoke. But the pulpit was too small for the fire in his blood. When he saw Jackie Wilson and James Brown, he realized that the streets needed a different kind of salvation. He realized that soul music was a ministry for the Saturday night sins that the Sunday morning prayers couldn't reach. The Philadelphia of Teddy's youth was a landscape of jagged edges. It was a city of Philly soul, yes, but it was also a city of hunger and hard lessons. Teddy drifted through the friction of the ghetto, running with crews and landing in juvenile lockup for a crime he didn't commit. He called it divine interruption, the first time the world tried to cage him. When he got out, he found his rhythm not in the choir, but in the kitchen of the restaurant where his mother cooked. He would sit for hours tapping out complex patterns on the tabletops with his fingers, learning to hear the pulse of a city that was constantly trying to break his beat. He began as a drummer, hiding behind the brass and the cymbals in small, smoke-filled clubs. He was the backbone, the silent engine of the band. He recorded a solo track titled Angel with Muddy Feet, but it died on the vine. Yet, a man who grew up in a house where 6 siblings had already passed away didn't fear failure. He understood that survival was the only true metric of success. The turning point came when Harold Melvin, a veteran of the doo-wop era, saw Teddy playing for the Cadillacs. Melvin didn't just hear a drummer, he saw a man who carried himself like a king even while sitting down. He invited Teddy to join the Blue Notes. At first, Teddy stayed behind the kit, the rhythmic heart of the group, but the voice inside him was a storm waiting for a crack in the door. He was a drummer with the soul of a prophet, and the night he finally stepped to the front of the stage, the world realized that the answered prayer of Etta Pendergrass was about to change the temperature of American music forever. For a long time, Teddy Pendergrass was a man defined by the rhythm of his hands rather than the power of his throat. In the early 1970 seconds, he sat behind the drum kit for Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, a group that had been struggling for a decade to find a foothold in the rapidly evolving landscape of soul music. Being a drummer gave Teddy a forensic perspective on music that most singers lack. He understood the pocket, that microscopic space between the beats where the emotion of a song truly lives. He wasn't just keeping time. He was absorbing the mechanics of how a hit record is built from the ground up. The transition from the drums to the front of the stage was not a calculated career move, but a biological necessity. During a rehearsal, the group's lead singer failed to show up, and Teddy stepped forward to fill the void. When he opened his mouth, the room didn't just hear a voice. They felt a shift in atmospheric pressure. Harold Melvin, a shrewd businessman and veteran of the industry, realized instantly that his drummer was actually his greatest asset. He moved Teddy to the front, and the Blue Notes were transformed from a standard doo-wop act into a powerhouse of the Philadelphia international sound. Under the guidance of legendary producers Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, Teddy's voice became the primary instrument of the Philly soul revolution. The forensics of his singing style during this era reveal a fascinating hybrid. He had the grit and growl of a Southern Baptist preacher, but it was wrapped in a sophisticated urban smoothness. Songs like I Miss You and If You Don't Know Me By Now became national anthems of heartbreak. Teddy didn't just sing lyrics, he interrogated them. He would stretch a syllable until it bled, or drop his voice to a whisper that felt like a hand on a shoulder. But success with the Blue Notes carried a heavy price. The group was named after Harold Melvin, yet it was Teddy's face on the posters and Teddy's voice on the radio that the fans were obsessed with. This created a structural friction that was destined to ignite. Melvin controlled the finances, the bookings, and the brand. Teddy, despite being the engine of the group's multi-platinum success, was still being paid as a hired hand. He was a man who felt like a king on stage but was treated like a servant in the accounting office. The investigation into the group's internal dynamics shows a growing resentment. A man who had survived the streets of Philly wasn't going to let another man own his labor forever. In 1975, the tension reached a breaking point. During a tour, Teddy demanded that the group's name be changed to Teddy Pendergrass and the Blue Notes. It was a claim of ownership, a forensic demand for his true value. Melvin refused, and the fallout was immediate. Teddy walked away, leaving behind the safety of the group and risking everything on a solo career. Many in the industry thought he was committing professional suicide. They believed his success was a product of the Melvin machine, not his own merit. They were wrong. When his self-titled solo debut dropped in 1977, it didn't just sell, it shattered expectations. Tracks like I Don't Love You Anymore and The Whole Town's Laughing at Me proved that Teddy was a sovereign talent. He leaned into his masculinity with a ferocity that the industry had never seen. He was the teddy bear, a massive, bearded man who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. He pioneered the women-only concerts, a marketing masterstroke that turned his live shows into a high-stakes ritual of intimacy. He would have rose petals scattered on the stage and perform in low red light, creating an environment where every woman in the audience felt like the only person in the room. By 1978, Teddy Pendergrass was a cultural phenomenon. He was the first black male artist to have 5 consecutive multi-platinum albums. He had achieved the solo rebellion he had dreamed of, but the forensics of his fame show that he was also becoming a prisoner of his own image. He was the Black Elvis, a symbol of sexual dominance that left very little room for the quiet, spiritual man who still attended church with his mother. He was living at a frantic pace, pursued by the police, who viewed his success with suspicion, and by the mob-linked elements of the music business who wanted a piece of his empire. He was a man standing on top of the world, but as the silver Rolls-Royce idled in the driveway of his mansion, the rhythm of his life was about to be interrupted by a silence that no drumbeat could ever fill. By 1977, Teddy Pendergrass was no longer just a singer. He had evolved into a cultural industry. When he stepped away from the shadow of Harold Melvin, he didn't just leave a group. He declared war on the industry's idea of what a black male artist should be. The forensics of his solo rise show a calculated shift in the architecture of R&B. Under the visionary guidance of producers Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff at Philadelphia International Records, Teddy became the laboratory for a new, aggressive kind of masculinity. He was raw, he was bearded, and he possessed a baritone that sounded like it had been aged in a cellar of oak and smoke. He was the solo rebellion personified, and the world was starving for his fire. The marketing of Teddy Pendergrass during these years was a masterclass in psychological branding. They created the teddy bear persona, a moniker that suggested a soft, approachable intimacy, while his physical presence screamed raw power. The most radical and successful experiment in this branding was the introduction of the "for women-only" concerts. These were not merely musical performances. They were carefully staged rituals of collective desire. Teddy would perform at midnight, the arenas bathed in deep, atmospheric crimson light, and the air was intentionally scented with the fragrance of thousands of long-stemmed roses. Men were strictly barred from the venue. This unprecedented move turned his concerts into a private sanctuary where female fans felt safe to express a level of hysteria and devotion, usually reserved for religious revivals. Teddy would stand at the edge of the stage, handing out chocolate lollipops and whispering, "Turn off the lights," to a crowd of 10,000 women who felt, for those 2 hours, that he was singing exclusively to them. The statistics of this era remain staggering even by modern standards. Teddy became the first black male singer in history to record 5 consecutive multi-platinum albums. From his 1,977 self-titled debut through to 1,981's It's Time for Love, he was commercially untouchable. He was selling out massive arenas that were previously considered the exclusive domain of white rock gods like Led Zeppelin or Elvis Presley. In fact, the mainstream media began calling him the Black Elvis, a title that spoke to his cross-cultural magnetism, but also highlighted the dangerous level of public obsession surrounding him. Every time he stepped out of a limousine, he faced a forensic level of scrutiny. He was a black man with immense wealth, undeniable sexual sovereignty, and a voice that commanded absolute attention, a combination that made him a lightning rod for both adoration and systemic suspicion in a country still wrestling with its racial soul. However, the pressure of being a living symbol is a heavy tax on the human spirit. The investigation into Teddy's personal life during these peak years reveals a man living in a state of high-velocity isolation. To maintain the perfection of the teddy bear image, he had to be perpetually on. He was the fantasy of millions, leaving very little room for the quiet, spiritual man who still attended church with his mother and valued his privacy. He retreated into a 34-room stone mansion in Gladwin, Pennsylvania, a fortress that served as both a palace for a king and a cage for a man who could no longer walk down a street without causing a riot. As his fame grew, so did the friction with the world around him. The Philadelphia Police Department viewed his sudden wealth and status with a forensic level of hostility. He was frequently pulled over in his luxury cars, harassed by officers who struggled to reconcile his skin color with the silver Rolls-Royce he drove. Simultaneously, there were whispers of mob interference in the booking of his shows and a manufactured rivalry with other soul titans like Marvin Gaye. Marvin, who had held the title of soul's sex symbol for a decade, reportedly felt the pressure of Teddy's more muscular, aggressive style. The industry had become a high-pressure cooker, and Teddy was the primary ingredient. He was earning $5,000 for every minute he spent on stage, yet he felt increasingly like a bank account wrapped in silk rather than a human being with a pulse. The psychological toll began to seep into the marrow of his music. While the hits continued to dominate the airwaves, classics like Close the Door and Love Tea, Kofer. The lyrics started to reflect a man who understood the hollowness of the fame chase. In songs like The Whole Town's Laughing at Me, he sang about the terrifying fragility of a reputation, offering a forensic premonition of how quickly a life can be dismantled. He was physically and emotionally exhausted, giving so much of his soul to the public that there was almost nothing left for his private self. By late 1981, Teddy Pendergrass was a man standing on a pedestal that had begun to vibrate with the tension of his own success. He had conquered the charts and redefined black masculinity, but the forensics of destiny are indifferent to platinum records. As he settled into the driver's seat of his car on that soft March night in 1982, the rebellion was reaching its climax, and a silence was waiting around the next curve that would change the meaning of his voice forever. The night of the 18th of March, 1982, began with the kind of effortless confidence that only a man at the absolute zenith of his powers can possess. Teddy Pendergrass was 31 years old, a physical giant who moved through the city of Philadelphia with the ease of a sovereign king. After a grueling week of rehearsals and high-profile social appearances, he found himself behind the wheel of his silver Rolls-Royce Silver Spirit. The car was more than a luxury vehicle. It was a fortress of leather and steel, a moving monument to the solo rebellion that had transformed him into the most successful black male artist in the United States. Beside him sat Tanika Watson, a nightclub performer he had recently met. The mood was light, the windows were cracked to let in the cool, damp spring air, and the city hummed with the distant, electric rhythm of the night. As Teddy navigated the winding, tree-lined curves of Lincoln Drive, the forensics of the moment suggest a fatal combination of mechanical failure and environmental hazard. Lincoln Drive was notorious among Philadelphia drivers for its sharp, unpredictable bends and narrow lanes that offered no margin for error. Investigators later reconstructed the grim timeline. At approximately 8 p.m., the heavy Rolls-Royce suddenly lost its grip on the asphalt. The steering failed to respond to mechanical blind spot in a machine otherwise engineered for perfection. The vehicle veered across the center line, slammed into a guardrail with the force of a tectonic shift, and careened violently into two massive oak trees. The sound was not a screech, but a dull, metallic roar that echoed through the woods. The impact didn't just crush the front of the car, it folded the engine block back toward the cabin, trapping Teddy in a cage of twisted chrome and shattered glass. For nearly an hour, the night was filled with the rhythmic blue flash of police lights and the frantic, industrial scream of hydraulic jaws of life cutting through the car's expensive hide. When they finally pulled him from the wreckage, the Black Elvis was a broken man. He was conscious, but eerily calm, his eyes wide and searching, while his body refused to obey even the simplest commands of his brain. The medical forensics at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital were devastating. The collision had caused a fracture dislocation of the C5 and C6 vertebrae, the critical junction of the spinal cord that controls motor function from the chest down. In the clinical, cold language of neurology, Teddy was diagnosed as a quadriplegic. The man who had built a global empire on his physical presence, who had moved across stages with the grace of a predator, was now tethered to a hospital bed. He was unable to move his hands, unable to feel the weight of his own legs, and unable to recognize the man reflected in the sterile monitors. In those first weeks of hospitalization, the psychological trauma proved to be as severe as the physical damage. Teddy lay in a bed of white sheets, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator and the distant chatter of nurses who often spoke about him in the past tense. The world outside was in a frenzy. News of the crash had sparked a media firestorm, but the headlines were not filled with prayers, they were filled with toxic rumors. The passenger's identity ignited a forensic obsession with Teddy's private life, and the press, which had once worshipped his hypermasculinity, now used the accident to interrogate his character. Teddy watched this betrayal from the isolation of his room, paralyzed not just by his spine, but by the realization that the public loved the icon, but feared the broken man. He reached a point of absolute darkness, famously asking his partner Karen Still to help him end his life. He saw the silence as a mercy. He could not imagine a future where the teddy bear sat in a chair, or a voice that had no functioning body to carry its weight. But as the heavy fog of painkillers began to lift, a different kind of rhythm emerged. The forensics of his spirit revealed a resilience he didn't know he possessed. He was alive, and despite the grim medical predictions, the golden throat remained intact. The crash had taken his movement, but it had not taken his breath. The long, agonizing journey from the guardrail back to the microphone was about to begin. The months following the accident were a forensic study in human endurance. For Teddy Pendergrass, the transition from an international sex symbol to a patient in a rehabilitation ward was a journey into a specific kind of purgatory. The world he once dominated, a world of vibration, movement, and heat, had been replaced by a clinical reality of cold steel, white tiles, and the smell of antiseptic. In the early days at Magee Rehabilitation Hospital, the man who had once been called the Black Elvis faced a silence so profound it threatened to erase his very identity. The psychological data of catastrophic injury suggests that the greatest hurdle is not the loss of function, but the loss of the future self. Teddy lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, mentally replaying the tapes of his sold-out concerts. He could still hear the roar of the crowd, but when he tried to clench his fist to catch the memory, nothing happened. This disconnect between the mind's intent and the body's response created a spiritual vacuum. He felt like a ghost haunting his own skin. He sank into a deep, clinical depression, reaching a point where he believed that a man who could not stand was a man who had no right to sing. He famously challenged his inner circle, asking them what use the world had for a broken teddy bear. However, the forensics of his recovery began with a single, involuntary note. One afternoon, while alone in his room, Teddy attempted to hum a simple melody. The sound was thin, lacking the muscular support of his diaphragm, but it was there. It was a forensic proof of life. He realized that while his legs were stilled, the golden throat was a sovereign territory that the accident had failed to conquer. This realization was the first crack in the darkness. He began to work with therapists who specialized in vocal cord rehabilitation for the paralyzed. Because he could no longer use his abdominal muscles to push the air, he had to learn an entirely new way to breathe. He had to learn to sing from the chest up, relying on the sheer strength of his lungs and the resonance of his throat. The support system around him acted as a human splint for his broken spirit. His mother, Etta, who had already survived the loss of 6 children and a husband, refused to let her only surviving son surrender. She brought the atmosphere of the Philly church into the hospital room, reminding him that he was still the answered prayer she had received in 1950. His partner, Karen Still, became his hands and his hope, refusing to let him retreat into the silence. They forced him to look in the mirror, not to see what was missing, but to see the fire that still burned in his eyes. By the end of 1983, the investigation into Teddy's state of mind showed a remarkable shift. He stopped asking, "Why me?" and started asking, "What now?" He began to understand that his voice carried a different weight now. If he could sing from a chair, he would be doing more than entertaining, he would be testifying. He realized that his vulnerability was not a weakness, but a new kind of power. He was no longer a man who sang to seduce. He was a man who would sing to survive. The dark night was beginning to yield to a gray, determined dawn. The world was waiting for the return of the king, but they were about to meet a man who was much stronger than the legend they remembered. There are moments in the forensics of music history where a single performance transcends entertainment and becomes a testament to the human will. On the 13th of July, 1985, 3 years after the silver Rolls-Royce crumpled on Lincoln Drive, that moment arrived. The setting was the Live Aid concert at Philadelphia's JFK Stadium, a global stage with nearly 100,000 people in attendance and an estimated 1.5 billion watching via satellite. For the world, it was a benefit for famine relief. For Teddy Pendergrass, it was his resurrection. The silence that greeted Teddy as he was wheeled onto the stage was not an absence of sound, but a vacuum of pure reverence. He was dressed in a pristine white suit, sitting in a motorized wheelchair, looking out at a city that had once seen him as a hyper-masculine god. The gasp from the crowd was audible, a collective realization of the cost of his survival. As the camera zoomed in, the forensics of his face told the story. The tremble of a bottom lip, the moisture in his eyes, and a jaw set with the grim determination of a soldier. He wasn't there to be pitied. He was there to reclaim his throne. When he began to sing "Reach Out and Touch," the sound was a revelation. It lacked the raw, muscular growl of his 1,970 seconds peak, but it possessed something far more potent, a spiritual resonance that felt as if it were vibrating through the very air. He had to breathe differently, using his neck and chest muscles to compensate for his paralyzed diaphragm, yet the delivery was flawless. The crowd didn't just cheer, they erupted in a wave of emotion that transcended race and status. In that moment, Teddy Pendergrass proved that while the teddy bear image had been shattered, the soul of the man was indestructible. The success of Live Aid acted as a forensic catalyst for his professional return. The industry, which had largely written him off as a tragic relic of the past, was forced to acknowledge his continued relevance. Asylum Records signed him to a new deal, and he returned to the recording studio with a renewed sense of purpose. The sessions for his 1984 album, Love Language, were a delicate balancing act. He had to find a new pocket for his voice, moving away from the aggressive seduction of his youth toward a more reflective, vulnerable tone. It was during these sessions that he collaborated with a young, relatively unknown backup singer named Whitney Houston. Their duet, Hold Me, became a bridge between two eras of soul. Listening to the forensics of that track, one can hear the torch being passed. Teddy's voice acts as a weathered, sturdy anchor for Whitney's soaring, youthful energy. The song became a hit, proving that Teddy could still compete on the charts from a wheelchair. He followed this with the 1988 album Joy, which reached the top of the R&B charts, mirroring the triumph of his pre-accident years. But the most significant part of his resurrection wasn't the platinum plaques. It was the shift in his identity. He no longer needed rose petals or red lights to command a room. He had learned that true power did not come from the ability to stand, but from the ability to keep singing when the world expected you to be silent. He had moved from being a sex symbol to being a symbol of life itself. The velvet storm had been stilled, but in its place was a steady, unquenchable light that offered hope to every person who had ever faced their own Lincoln Drive. Teddy was back, not as he was, but as he was always meant to be, a man whose voice was a map for survival. By the turn of the millennium, Teddy Pendergrass had achieved something far rarer than fame. He had achieved a legacy of grace. He no longer measured his worth by the height of his chart positions or the volume of the screams in an arena. Instead, he measured it by the lives he touched through his silence and his service. In 1998, he founded the Teddy Pendergrass Alliance, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing vocational training, housing, and legal assistance to individuals with spinal cord injuries. The man who had once been the center of the world's attention now dedicated his energy to those the world often chose to ignore. The forensics of his final decade reveal a man who had finally reconciled the teddy bear myth with the reality of his human condition. He moved through the world with a quiet, regal dignity, often visiting hospitals without cameras or fanfare just to sit beside newly paralyzed patients. He didn't offer cliches. He offered his presence a forensic proof that life could be beautiful even when it was broken. He became a primary advocate for the Americans with Disabilities Act, using his celebrity status to demand that the architecture of the world change to accommodate the spirits it had previously excluded. In 2009, Teddy faced his final biological battle. He was diagnosed with colon cancer, a new complication for a body that had already endured more than its fair share of trauma. The investigation into his final months shows a man who faced his mortality with the same courage he had used to face the Lincoln Drive guardrail. There was no bitterness, no "why me?" He had already learned that life was a gift on loan, not a permanent possession. He underwent surgery and fought quietly, surrounded by the people who had walked through the dark with him, his mother Etta, his wife Joan, and the fans who had never stopped listening. On the 13th of January 2010, at the age of 59, Teddy Pendergrass took his final breath in a Philadelphia hospital. When the news broke, the city fell into a collective silence. Radio stations across America didn't just play his hits, they played the sound of a man who had refused to be erased. The forensics of his life story offer a powerful conclusion. Soul music is not about the strength of the lungs, but the resilience of the spirit. Today, Teddy's influence is woven into the very fabric of modern music. Every time a soul singer leans into a vulnerable baritone or a R&B artist shares their pain without apology, they are standing on the shoulders of the man from Gladwin. He taught us that masculinity is not about physical dominance, but about the strength to endure. He showed us that the music doesn't end when the body stops moving, it simply finds a deeper frequency. Teddy Pendergrass came into the world as an answered prayer, lived his life as a velvet storm, and left it as a legend of grace. The voice is still there, echoing in every heart that has ever needed a song to survive.